Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video we're going to be talking Diablo 4 as the beta is out and a lot of people have been asking me for my impressions and if it's any good. So we're going to be covering exactly that. But first, this is of course a beta. It's not indicative of how the game is going to end up in endgame, but I'm sure there's going to be plenty of clues and connections to how the endgame will end up, and we're going to be talking about those and speculating a little about how things will play out. And of course, the biggest thing I want to talk about though is that Diablo 4 is not the game I was personally expecting it to be. It is quite a different beast, and we'll go over what that is and if it ends up being for you in this video. Alright, the first thing to discuss is going to be the open world. The biggest thing which I wasn't expecting to be such a pronounced feature. So the Diablo 4 world is truly immense, and it is very much open world. If you were to compare Diablo 4 to any game, it would have to be to Lost Ark. Now the combat system isn't quite or really at all like Lost Ark's, and the endgame is different too, but the exploration of the map and the completionist focus is absolutely the same. In every zone, you're going to want to go ahead and pretty much complete everything, as there are a ton of bonuses tied to everything that you do in the world. Whether that's additional waypoints, experience, skill points, attributes, all sorts of stuff is available, for better or for worse. In addition to that, there is also resources that you'll be wanting to gather in the open world, which can be used for crafting, enhancing your items, as well as making consumables. So you can see here, got a glittering ore vein, break that open, get the chunks. Now, overall, this is probably going to be the biggest defining factor in whether or not you're going to enjoy Diablo 4. There are two pieces of endgame content currently that I'm aware of and have seen in the beta that are present in the open world, which you will most likely be farming on repeat. The first of all is going to be world bosses. These appear to be on a timer, although we're not 100% sure if that's just for the beta. These world bosses drop a material which allows you to add sockets to your gear. I haven't found anything else in the beta currently which drops these. It's possible it does come from other things, but it's pretty much a guarantee that it drops from the world bosses, and farming them is probably going to be the best source of them. The next is called Whispers. Whispers are essentially world quests or events from MMOs which you can encounter while exploring areas. Completing these generally takes 1 to 2 minutes and will award you with a resplendent chest, at least that's what it has for me, containing a ton of gold as well as rare items and sometimes legendary. But in addition to that, it'll also award you a currency called Obols. Obols can be traded to a vendor in town for a bunch of item bases which are unidentified. It's essentially gambling. So if you play Path of Exile, it's Gwenin, and if you play Diablo, it's the Gambler. This is essentially the reward you get for completing overworld content. The other thing I wasn't expecting, but probably should have been, is the absolutely massive quantity of lore and quests in the game. So the campaign is most likely going to be pretty extensive. If I had to guess, it's probably going to be 40 to 60 hours if you do it all and you read all the text, maybe even longer. And there's also, it seems, hundreds of side quests which you can complete. These aren't voice acted, but there's of course plenty of text there if you want. You wouldn't be caught dead completing all these quests in Path of Exile, but I'm sure that there's definitely a lot of players who are really going to enjoy the lore here, and it seems a lot of development time and focus has gone into making sure that the world feels alive, there is quests to do, and there is lore to unpack. So that's going to be a big part of the game. And I have to imagine both the world content and the questing and story content are going to play a big part of the future seasons. And that might be something which really is going to be a deciding factor on whether or not you come back for a season versus another player. Alright, so before we get into the meat of it, let's cover the big three: performance, graphics, and sound. So the performance for me, unfortunately, in the beta has been pretty bad. There's been massive lag spikes up to a minute long, disconnects, massive stuttering, warping, the works. Now I've been told that this is actually the result of a memory leak in the game, but I've also been told that it can be fixed before launch. Of course, beta is beta, and the servers are probably overloaded as well, which doesn't help. My computer's also not the best. Moving on to graphics, they're great. I think the game looks fantastic, and I really like the aesthetic and the dark and gritty feel. But that's going to be on a case-by-case basis based on you. In addition to that, obviously the sound, in my opinion, is the strongest part of the game. The combat feels great. The overall vibe of the game is great through the sound, and I think it's an A+ or S tier sound-based game for me. Alright, on to the backbone of the game, and that is going to be combat, items, and character progression. Let's get into it. So, as a bit of a background, I am generally known as a content creator who makes videos about farming and item acquisition in Path of Exile, and I'd like to think I'm okay at it. And I've applied a similar mindset to Diablo 4 here, and I've tried to extract as much information out of the beta as possible on how things might play out. And I figured I'd share all that with you guys. So the first thing to cover gonna be here is gonna be character progression. So overall, the beta doesn't show us too much about how you're gonna be able to push your character, but it does allow you to get a general feel of all of the skills. So I've leveled up a sorcerer and a rogue, and so far I can say mechanically the sorcerer has felt pretty damn good, while the rogue definitely felt a little lacking. If you're looking for a comparison and where to place the combat and the overall feel of the characters, it's going to be more on a Last Epoch level. That's where they've pitched it. It's definitely nothing like Path of Exile, but it's not so simple that it's going to bore you out of your mind. Let's go into a little bit more detail on how that applies to characters though. So of course this is going to be in the context of a sorcerer, but let's dive in. Alright, so the first thing you guys are going to have and see in the game is going to be that of the skill tree here. It's a linear skill tree which progresses as you place more points in it. You'll unlock additional tracks as you place the points in each respective branch. So each section represents a school of magic or skill that your class has. You can see this is basic and this is core. And every character is pretty much going to consist of having a core build, the enabling skill, which is going to revolve around spending a resource. For the wizard or sorcerer, it's mana. For the rogue, it's energy. For the barbarian, it's fury. And they're also going to have a builder, which is pretty much exactly how it was in Diablo 3 as well. So you're going to have a spender, you're going to have a builder, that's 2 skills locked in. You can have a total of 6. The other 2 schools are generally going to be utility or defensive based. So you've got a mobility ability here for the wizard, teleport. Most likely people are always going to be taking their mobility skill and locking it in. And the reason for that is that in Diablo 4, the mobility abilities, or at least the ones I've tried, are all stun breaks. So they get you out of stuns, immobilizes, and disables, of which there is a lot in the game. They're also going to be pretty important for clearing content quickly, I imagine. So I imagine that's going to find your way onto the bar as well. And then next, of course, we do have a defensive set of abilities for pretty much every class. For the barbarian, they have shouts. For the rogue, they have shadow shroud kind of things going on. And for the wizard, they have barriers. So I imagine you're probably going to be rolling with one of them as well. So it's already 4 abilities pretty much locked in. Next up, you obviously have different parts of your kit, cooldown based ones. You know, for the wizard, it's conjuration spells. They're pretty much all cooldown based. You also have ultimates which you can use. The rogue has imbues, which are basically cooldown enhancements which they can have on their abilities for 10 to 9 seconds. And overall, I imagine you're going to be sporting 2-ish cooldowns. So a basic attack to build stamina or energy, a spender, a defensive, a mobility, and 2 flex spots, most likely cooldowns, is pretty much what I can see most builds consisting of in the end game and pretty much throughout the whole game. So how can you customize these skills? Well, each skill has 5 ranks, of which you can invest skill points in. Most of the time, I think it's going to be a pretty binary decision. If you're using a skill for utility, you'll put 1 point in it. If you're using a skill for damage, you'll put 5 points in it. Other than that, you can invest an additional 2 points in enhancing the skill in 2 different ways. The first point you invest is always going to be the same. You're going to get an enhanced effect for the skill. You're pretty much always going to take this for most skills that you use. Then you get an option between 2 other talent points. So for here, you can see that Spark can get crit for all of your kit if you use it. And then the other one is going to give you a chance to get Crackling Energies, which is a mechanic for a lightning-based wizard. So if we go for the crit, that's going to be the way that we're using Spark to build crit for their other skills. And each of these skills have those 2 decisions. So a main talent, which you're pretty much always going to get, and a choice between 2. In addition to that, the talent tree also does have the ability to go ahead and take some other skill points. So you can see here, you get a pretty interesting effect. And then they've also got more simple ones like 18% increased damage, but you take 9% more damage, glass cannon. Overall, these seem pretty interesting for some of them, but less interesting for others. So a good example of a more interesting one would be the ones further towards the end of your tree. So you can see here that you've got one like here, Pyromancy. When you get a lucky hit, which is basically a proc in this game, you have a 5% chance to immobilize the enemy. And it's doubled if the target, if you are healthy, which means on full life. So definitely a little bit of wiggle room there. You can make some pretty interesting builds, I imagine. And overall, there is going to be some stuff to customize and some stuff to kind of min-max and play around with. So that's going to be the majority of the character progression, which we've got in the beta. On release, there's also going to be what's called the Paragon board, which we can take a quick look at here, as it has been data mined for the most part. Someone has made a little bit of a GitHub tool here, of course, in true ARPG fashion, and you can take a look and see what your class is kind of roughly getting in terms of some of its points using this tool. Now, of course, beta is beta. It could all change in the 3 months leading up to release. But in general, essentially you're going to get an option between a number of Paragon boards in the end game, which are essentially component trees from Path of Exile, which you can slot and connect together, and you can path all around on. You get 200 points total, and these trees sport legendary nodes, which are essentially keystones from Path of Exile, rare nodes, which are essentially notables from Path of Exile, and jewel sockets, which are jewel sockets from Path of Exile. And each of these pretty much work exactly like they do in Path of Exile. It's also got small travel nodes, which you'll be able to pick up for additional stats for your character. Now, overall, the way these seem to play out are in themes. So you can see over here that this is a board which features a passive called Searing Heat, which is the legendary or keystone of this board. Now, I imagine that this is the fire-themed board because it also has a node here called Pyromancy, as well as a few others like Keeper of Flames. Now, in a similar fashion, there is other boards which are similarly themed around lightning and cold, the other two elements of the sorcerer. So while it looks like there might be a lot of choice, I imagine that when it actually boils down to it, there's actually not going to be as much choice as it looks like there's going to be, and it's not going to be as intimidating as you would think. I imagine you're going to pick a build, fire, cold, or lightning as a sorcerer, and then you're just going to pick the corresponding boards that go with it and path through them to get all of the big, juicy, rare, and legendary nodes. Now, I also did talk about gem sockets there, that you can socket them in, and you will be able to get bonus effects from them, but we'll talk about them with gear as they come from a pretty specific point in the game and only in endgame. It's worth noting the Paragon board is only available after level 50, and that is the reason we have not got any in-game footage of it or look at it in the game. So overall, character customization, does it look good? It looks okay. I think there's plenty of meat on the bone there, and you're going to be able to make some pretty interesting and unique characters on a case-by-case basis. Combined with gear, I can see plenty of customization in there for most players. If you're looking for some crazy Path of Exile level shenanigans though, it's definitely not on that level, but for the most people playing the game, I think it's more than sufficient in general. Alright, let's talk about items next. Arguably the most important part of any ARPG and the sole purpose of why you're grinding and still playing after you hit max level outside of completionism. So in Diablo 4, there is a ton of different rarities of items, and each higher rarity is more powerful. So in the basic kind of game here, which is going to be world tiers 1 to 2, which is essentially levels 1 to 50 in layman's terms, you're going to have the 4 different rarities. You're going to have common, which is no modifiers, magic, which is 2 modifiers, rare is 3 modifiers, legendary is 4 modifiers, and a special legendary modifier. So the way this system works is essentially as you would think. The best items are the legendary ones. They have the most mods and they have a special affix. Now, it's not like all the other items are useless, magic and normal are, but rare items can be imbued with legendary modifiers though. So you could, in theory, find a rare item with 3 really good modifiers and you're like, damn, that's awesome. And you could slap a legendary affix on there, no problems. However, it's still not going to be good as finding a naturally rolled legendary item because those have 4 potential modifiers on them. In this base level of the game, I imagine the best items are going to be rare items with 3 good, really solid modifiers imbued with a legendary affix. And then if you get lucky and find a crazy 4 mod item, you'd use that too. But the chances of getting an item you want to use with the right rolls and the right legendary affix, it's pretty small. Alright, so this of course ranges on all the affixes as well. So you can see here I have a ton of different items with a ton of different affixes, and you will obviously have a bit of RNG involved there. Let's talk a little bit about those affixes on the items though, because those need to be interesting in order to be fun. Now, for the most part, you've got your usual candidates. You've got your damage stats like attack speed, crit damage, increased damage of an element. But then you've also got more situational stats, which are a little bit hit or miss in my opinion. So there is a ton of stats in the game, like 5% damage to slowed enemies, 5% damage to vulnerable enemies, etc, etc. And these are going to make up probably about 30 to 40% of the stats you end up finding on your gear in general. So you can see here I've got overpower damage, vulnerable damage against crowd control, against slowed, and in my opinion, these are a little bit of a miss for me. I'm not a big fan of conditional damage, and a lot of these aren't actually usable for my class. I'm playing a lightning sorcerer, so there's no way for me to slow enemies. And even if there was, it's not so much that I would love to go out and get that on my gear when I could get generic damage instead. Now it doesn't stop there though, there is obviously some other stats you can get, namely defense. Now defense in this game hasn't really been a big part of the beta. There's never been a stage where I felt like I needed to build defense or go for resistances like in Path of Exile. However, they are present here. You can see here that there are a ton of resistances, and you can get them and mitigate a ton of your damage as well. Now, in my opinion, I don't believe this works like Path of Exile or Diablo 2 resistances. I'm pretty sure it is based on a formula, and it's not going to give you a good exponentially scaling form of defense. So I'm not sure how effective these will be. In addition to that, armor mitigates all damage in this game instead of just one type, physical in Diablo 2 and in PoE. So it's much more effective in D4, and that's on every piece of gear anyway. So I'm not sure how important defense is going to be in the long run. Lastly, there is of course plus X rank to skills. Now these are about 10% more effect of whatever skill you are using. Sometimes it throws in mana cost reductions or energy cost reductions, as well as cooldown reductions as well. There doesn't appear to be any breakpoints in terms of getting additional hydras for a hydra skill or getting additional projectiles on a projectile skill. It's just pure damage and sometimes some reduced cooldown. Now, this is pretty good though, because it works out to be about 10% more, which is, obviously a pretty big incentive versus getting some other stats. So this is probably the most powerful stat you can get on your gear. Now, I said that there was 7 different rarities of items, and I only talked about 4. So what are these other 3? Well, they appear to be end game only types of rarities. I don't know exactly how many stats they have, but you can see here that in World Tier 3, which is 50 to 70, you can start to drop sacred and unique items. Unique items are essentially unique items from Path of Exile. They are statistically normally always the same, with ranges, and they have a special effect which is normally build defining. I imagine this is probably where you're going to get a lot of your character customization and builds from. And they're said to be incredibly rare. Sacred items, I have no idea what these are, and then in Torment, there's another item type called Ancestral. So I imagine that these are all going to be non-tradable and the most powerful items in the game. Currently, all the 4 base rarities are tradable in the beta. Okay, so your endgame items are probably going to consist of items of the last 3 rarities, but because we don't have access to them, let's talk a little bit about what you can do to items in terms of enhancements and adjustments, because, making sure that items are just how you want them is pretty important in all ARPGs. So you're going to hone in on stats you're going to want pretty quickly, and of course there's going to be guides just as fast. So it's not going to be any surprise that you're going to be hunting for items with 3 or 4 modifiers that you want. In order to acquire those modifiers, there are a few ways to change your gear to get them. So first up, we're going to have item sockets, which can be applied to any pieces of gear with available sockets on them. So you can see here this has 4 based affixes and an empty socket, and it does give me the option to add an additional one. Now these cost the scattered prisms, which we talked about earlier, which are going to be farmed from world bosses most likely. Now doing so will obviously give you this a gem socket. Now the gems in Diablo 4 unfortunately are pretty underwhelming, I would say. But that's definitely a limited perspective of what I've seen in the beta. You can see here that they're categorized into what you socket the gem in. So weapons are generally going to be some form of a damage stat. However, the only non-conditional one I've seen here is that of the diamond, which gives you ultimate skill damage, and all the rest are conditional. So you can see here crit strike damage against controlled enemies. You get basic skill damage, which, okay, basic skill is not the best anyway. Overpower damage, against vulnerable enemies, and damage over time, etc. So I'm not sure damage is going to really come from gems. It's possible it might, but at this stage, it doesn't seem too crazy. There is a lot of defensive setups that you can get with the gems as well, but I'm not seeing anything which I'm losing my mind over, apart from maybe the life here, which I've got my eye on. In general, I don't expect gem sockets to be too crazy offensively, but I'm sure they're going to be pretty good defensively, and if that does become a factor in Diablo 4, I'm sure that they will be sought after and you will want to socket some good gems in. But right now, I haven't felt any incentive to go for gems. The next thing to cover is item upgrading, which I have to assume is going to be present for all rarities of items because it is for the first 4. To upgrade an item, you need a set amount of reagents, so I've got 72 iron chunks here, which can either be farmed in the overworld or from salvaging items to a vendor. Now, overall, there is no gameplay in this at all. It just upgrades all the stats across the board evenly, and is basically just a resource dump and a currency sink. The final 2 systems which can be used to modify items are present on the Occultist. So the Occultist is essentially an enchanter, and the first thing they can do is turn rare items into legendary items. In order to get a legendary affix as an available enchant, you're going to have to complete a quest or a dungeon, and you can see the reward for them on the map and the overworld before you enter. So all you'll need is your item, so you got here my rare ring here, a way and a thing you want to enchant, so maybe I want to enchant Ice Shards, pierce 3 times, and then you're going to go ahead and just slam it on there, and you can go ahead and enchant that and turn that into a legendary. Now this is a system I think that is only intended for early game, as I don't imagine you're going to be able to enchant and imbue the more exotic items like uniques with legendary powers. In addition to that, the legendary items you create through the system are never going to be as good as naturally dropped ones with perfect stats. So overall, in my opinion, this is just an easy way for people to gear up and get some temporary power. The next thing you can do is, of course, you can enchant your items somewhat by modifying the items on there somewhat. So you can see here, if I take this item here, I can choose one stat to re-roll. And you can re-roll this stat infinitely as long as you have enough currency and materials to go ahead and do so. So I wanted to take these gloves, and I didn't want the 12 strength on here. I could choose to re-roll that, and it's going to give me 2 additional options here. So I could take the chain lightning, or I could take the attack speed. If I wanted to take the attack speed, I could do so. Now you can re-roll this infinitely, but the scaling will get pretty brutal and it will exponentially go up in terms of the materials and the gold. But it is a good way to kind of improve your items. This is particularly brutal though when you try and do it on a legendary, as it requires a very rare material which I haven't encountered a single one of yet. It appears to be a herb from a world kind of quest here, so I don't imagine you're going to be re-rolling legendaries too frequently, and you're going to only be doing it on the best one possible. Again, another incentive for you to do world-based content though, so I imagine that is going to be a big part of endgame. So the last thing to cover is going to be combat as well as grinding or, mapping from other games. So in terms of the actual mapping or content that you're going to be doing in endgame, I have to imagine it's going to consist of dungeons, which we're about to talk about, as well as the overworld content, that being gathering materials, doing world bosses, and doing world events. In your downtime, you're probably going to be doing the dungeons. So the dungeons, which I can see in the game and is most likely going to be how it plays out, is going to be exactly what you're about to see and what I'm going to talk about, but enhanced and more difficult and scalable up to a tier of level 100. These dungeons, which are scaled, are called Chaos Sigils, and are essentially going to have random modifiers as well as enhanced loot and higher item level monsters. So let's take a look at what a dungeon is, and we'll talk a little bit about combat. So overall, dungeons do seem to be infinitely repeatable, and they're easily resettable by taking a look at the map and clicking Reset Dungeon. Each dungeon consists of an objective that you need to complete, sometimes 2, and these are almost always kill monsters to fill a gauge, kill specific special monsters, or clear out an entire area, with a few others thrown in there for good measure. But the majority of ones that I've seen are kill X enemies or totems or something like that, and doing any of these objectives will open up a door which will either lead to another objective or a boss. Now in this game, so far in the beta, loot does seem a little bit weird. So when you're slaying enemies, you'll notice that all enemies drop gold, but only rare enemies and chests drop loot in terms of magic items, rares, and legendaries. Now that creates a pretty interesting scenario, where when you're doing a dungeon, you're pretty much only interested in opening chests, as well as going for rare or champion, in this case that's what they're called, monsters. So you'll see here, this Shiverwing Bear will 100% drop either a magic, rare, or legendary, but pretty much nothing in this dungeon else you'll see will drop one. So there's my loot. Nothing in the pack, else in the pack dropped anything. I hope this is just part of beta and that's not actually how it ends up being in the game, because it doesn't incentivize you to go for anything other than the rare mobs and the chest. So you'll just basically be speed running to objectives, killing any rares on the way, and that's basically all there is to it. You can see there it's pretty obvious that it's pretty much just the rares dropping stuff. Now the next thing I want to talk about is going to be combat, and then we'll round the video out. So combat in Diablo 4 is absolutely more similar to something like Last Epoch than it is to something like Path of Exile. It's far more slow, far more methodical, and all the skills are on a much more fair playing field. You're not going to be throwing out like 20 fireballs in a 360 around you and blowing up the whole screen. Pretty much ever, it seems, with the way that things are looking. Now, of course, legendaries and sets and all sorts of stuff like that have plenty of time and room to change that now and in the future for release. But right now, the game definitely feels like it's probably going to play pretty similarly to how I'm playing right now, which is definitely on the more calculated, slow, and methodical path. Now, overall, that's not going to be a bad thing, but it's definitely going to have to be appealing to your certain way to play ARPGs. It's definitely more similar to playing D2 or Last Epoch than anything else. Now, overall, is the dungeon experience what you're looking for? Well, that's really going to come down to whether or not you enjoy the combat. The loot is pretty much what you'd expect from any game. In terms of random events, there are a few, but for the most part, it's going to be the same dungeon over and over again. The boss will be the same, the event will be the same, and the layout will also be the same. In terms of rare events, you can occasionally encounter the Butcher, who will spawn in randomly out of a portal, and he is very hard. You can encounter loot goblins, and sometimes there's special shrines which also, when you click on them, will spawn a bunch of monsters and ask you to defend them for 1 minute and then give you a big chest. Furthermore, sometimes chests and barrels are also trapped and will spawn that similar event as well. But outside of that, it's pretty much doing the same dungeon on repeat. When you introduce Chaos Sigils, of course, you will get some randomness there, but for the most part, it will just be the same thing, but harder it seems. Of course, I haven't played Chaos Sigils, so I'm not 100% sure, but that does seem to be the direction we're moving in. Now, overall, that's going to conclude my review of Diablo 4. Whether or not I recommend it is pretty much going to be entirely up to whether you've liked all the systems I've talked about so far. With a big emphasis on open world and doing things in the overworld, people who like to collect stuff are probably going to really enjoy that. Now, that's personally not for me, so I find that more of a chore than anything. And if it's something that you have to do seasonally, that might be a little bit annoying. But for people who really enjoy that, that's great. In terms of the lore and all the story, that's also not something that really appeals to me, but if that really jumps out at you, it's going to be well worth your money to pick the game up and explore that. In terms of the combat, it's not like Path of Exile, and I really like going fast, so it's a little bit on the slow side for me, but it's not so slow that I'd mark it off as unplayable, so it's not too bad. In terms of the itemization and the farming, it's definitely on the little bit of a simplistic side in terms of stuff, but that just gives it a lot of room to grow in the future, and I imagine they're leaving plenty of room for new seasons and things that they can do with the Chaos Dungeons, as well as interesting things they can implement in the overworld. So is it a must buy? Well, in my opinion, I'd recommend trying out the open beta coming up for yourself first before diving in, because I think the combat itself is the biggest and most polarizing feature of the game. If you don't enjoy the combat, you're not going to enjoy playing the game overall, and that's the thing you absolutely have to try first, and I would absolutely recommend doing so before investing in the full product. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video and it's been informative. In terms of my time with Diablo 4, it's been interesting to say the least, and I'm very keen to see how it plays out in endgame, and until then, cheers.